This is Thinking in Public, a program dedicated to intelligent conversation about frontline theological and cultural issues with the people who are shaping them. I'm Albert Mohler, your host and president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Stephen D. Smith is the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego. Since earning his law degree from Yale University, Professor Smith has taught at numerous institutions, including the law schools of Notre Dame University and the University of Virginia. Prior to that, he served as a law clerk for 3 years on the prestigious United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He's a sought-after legal authority, especially on issues of religious freedom. His most recent book, Pagans and Christians in the City, Culture Wars from the Tiber to the Potomac, makes an important argument about the clash of worldviews playing out now in the public square. That book is the topic of our conversation today. Professor Stephen Smith, welcome to Thinking in Public.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with you.
I have looked at your work over the course of the last several years, and I've read your books as they have come out. It's a remarkable production by any measure, and your books generally published by major university publishers. So I want to turn to the content of the books, but let me just ask you as kind of a background question. How do you approach writing your book, such as your newest book, which is going to be the main topic of our conversation, Pagans and Christians in the City? What is your process of writing?
Well, I'll answer that. I'll try to answer that on a couple of levels. Yeah. One is I actually never planned to be a law professor or a lawyer for that matter. And I ended up through some, interesting circumstances in this field, which has worked out pretty well for me. But I've always been more interested, to tell you the truth, in like religious and philosophical type questions than in strictly legal questions. Yeah. I just don't work up the interest to write a book or even a major law review article on a purely legal question. So from the beginning of my career, I've always sort of look for places in which the law interacts with religion or philosophy, or sometimes, to be honest, some way in which I can explore some religious or philosophical question that I'm interested in a way that I can sort of put it in a legal guise so it might be publishable in a legal source. So I usually get interested in some subject and I try to find some legal application for it. More mechanically, I think people do this differently. I tend to research and write at the same time. I'm not someone who does all the research first and then writes up the results. I kind of have done some reading, some research. I start writing something. I do more reading as I go along. The reading shapes the writing and the writing shapes the reading. So.
Yeah, actually, in Pagans and Christians in the City, you engage with a book that came out, a major book, while you're writing the book, and you engage with it, but point out that you weren't able to do as much with it as if it had been written before you began the book.
You might be referring to Tony Kronman's book,
yes.
Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
right.
Yeah,
I had seen little notices indicating he was working on something on that subject, but I even at one point emailed him and said, I understand you're working on a book on paganism. And he, who is a really nice cooperative guy, by the way, I think, but he didn't, maybe because I didn't realize this, but his book is like 1,200 pages long or something.
It's massive.
He didn't send it to me.
Yeah.
He just said it'll be out,
Yeah.
And I think it came out maybe in 2017 when I had pretty much finished this one. It takes a while with an academic book. Right. Between when you finish it and when it actually sees the light. So all I could do was add a couple of references to Kronman's book.
Well, speaking of your first kind of meta picture of how you write, you're on good ground there because even the formation of the medieval university, there are basically three professions: medicine, law, and theology. Mm-hmm. And they were because they were the three most pressing issues of public consequence in the medieval world, and of course built around the universitas, the idea of the unity of truth, actually in Christ, with theology, the queen of the sciences. But if you just take the two most famous of the magisterial reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin, both of them were intended for the law, but ended up in theology. So
right, yeah.
There's a sense in which you're on very good ground.
With me, in a sense, it went the other way from Martin Luther. I would have preferred to go to grad school in philosophy or something of that sort, and ended up in law, but still found a way to bring them together, I think.
Yeah, but interestingly, both Calvin and Luther, of course, had fathers who wanted them to go into the law because they wanted the money that would come with the legal profession. But you've been in the teaching of law now for a long time. In your latest book, Pagans and Christians in the City, the subtitle, Culture Wars from the Tiber to the Potomac, you really expand on the arguments you've been making for years. And I have a small library of your books, The Disenchantment of Secular Discourse and The Rise and Decline of American Religious Freedom. But actually you have 4 books on religious freedom issues prior to these that I brought. But in this latest one, you really kind of update your argument and you place it in the context of a different cultural moment. You were hinting at all of this in your previous books, but something has happened in the culture that occasioned pagans and Christians in the city.
Yes. Well, if you're interested to know what immediately caused that, I can actually tell you in this case. So I had not really studied much Roman history as an undergraduate or before. I started reading a little. I'd been interested in Christian history for some time, and I'd started reading a little Roman history several years earlier because, like many people, I start wondering about parallels between some of the things that happened in the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire and things that are happening today. But I hadn't done much with that. Then in 2015, you'll probably recall Indiana passed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and basically all hell broke loose. And I was asked by a sort of a religious freedom blog to write a little essay on that. And as it happened, I had been reading the T.S. Eliot book that I start this book with. Yes. And so you're always looking for a little different angle rather than just say the same thing that everybody says. So I worked the T.S. Eliot book in for a paragraph. And as it happened, Stanley Fish likes to visit at the University of San Diego, and he was out at San Diego, and he's always a fun person to talk with. And he read my little blog entry, and he said, well, it was pretty interesting. And the thing that made it interesting was the T.S. Eliot material. And it just occurred to me, it would be interesting to expand that, and it would give me an opportunity to read a lot of things that I'd like to read anyway, and so forth. So I didn't know what of the different things I start. Some of them go someplace and a lot of them don't. But I started that one, and I just started reading a lot of Roman and early Christian history for a while. And so that part of the book, of course, is probably half of the book now is sort of Roman history, which isn't my specialty, but I found it to be quite, I hope, illuminating. It was for me, at least.
Well, I think it will be for any reader. And I think particularly for those who think they have some idea, in the Western tradition, we have kind of an inheritance of interpretation on Rome. And unfortunately, at the head of the most influential stream is someone like Edward Gibbon, his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he basically, by my view, gets almost everything wrong. But that has become.
But he writes very well.
Well, right. I mean, I think of Winston Churchill, by the way, writing his mother during the First World War, asking her to send him Gibbon, by the way, to make your point. And his Leather and Guilt, of course, edition of Gibbon came, and later in life, Churchill having won, by the way, the Nobel Prize in Literature. He actually credited Gibbon's prose with helping him to find his voice in writing. So no, there's no doubt his argument would have been probably submerged, but for the eloquence of his prose.
And it does obviously have a kind of majestic sweep to it,
Sure.
But it does, as I say, as you said. I mean, it reflects the Enlightenment take on things. I think that was standard among Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century. The kind of anti-Christianity, that sort of thing, which I think in many quarters today, especially in the academy where I work, is just axiomatic almost. I mean, people who haven't necessarily looked into it much, but they just take that as established truth.
So before we turn to issues of law, let's talk about what interested you, because frankly, both of these fascinate me. I have several editions of Gibbon, including one that came out the year of its publication. It's interesting. I have an ongoing conversation with Gibbon. And then you mentioned T.S. Eliot. Most people know him by his poetry. I actually find much of his poetry incredibly theologically revealing. But it's his prose that I think draws me even more. And you draw attention to his essay, as does Robert P. George at Princeton, in his very eloquent foreword to your book. It's his essay on a Christian society that really, has, with its distinction between paganism and Christianity, and Eliot's prescient observation that paganism is back and big. Mm-hmm. And then with Gibbon, the two things I think he got wrong, which are his two main points, were that paganism was this productive, tolerant, life-affirming worldview that gave Rome strength, whereas the second issue is he held that Christianity eventually became intolerant, inflexible, took the joie de vivre out of Roman life and led to the Roman Empire's collapse. I think on both counts, he's just absolutely wrong.
Right. So, Gibbon sort of famously said that the Roman Empire fell because of the forces of barbarism and Christianity. And he does obviously give a really negative depiction of Christianity and Judaism, even more so. He doesn't say that much about Judaism, but right. Very negative depiction of Judaism, I think. But I suggest in one of the chapters that both Roman pagans and Christians thought that there should be some mutually acceptable way of living together, right. Fully respectful of each other. Christians like Tertullian certainly say that, we support the Senate, we pray for the emperor, why do you persecute us? And Romans, I think that many, let's say, sophisticated Romans would have thought that, we have polytheistic, an embracing kind of religion. We can embrace deities of, all kinds and so forth. And we could embrace your deities, they thought, I think, about Christianity, as long as you were willing to, have them just be, your God be one God among the various gods right. of the pantheon. What's so unacceptable about that? And I think on both sides, they sort of failed to understand how the terms that they thought should have been mutually acceptable really weren't. Right. The pagan terms were, Christians like Lactantius would say, they want us to have our God acknowledged as one among many, but to do that would be to renounce our God. That is right. not the God, that we worship. But on the other side of things, it was sort of true also that Christians and the Christian gospel was subversive of the religious foundations sure. Of the Roman Empire, which were pagan. So to that extent, although Gibbon's sort of pejorative characterization of Christianity, something I don't share at all, I think he was right that Christianity was one thing that in a certain sense was subversive of the ancient Roman Empire. It's complicated because, of course, it also sort of held the empire together after Constantine for a while. You could argue that it helped to revive and hold it together for a period of time.
Well, I certainly agree with you on those observations. And if nothing else, the statement that Jesus Christ is Lord relativized instantly all of the emperor worship, and that of course, that is not a matter of Christian shame, but of Christian pride. Right. But and by the way, you have a very pithy way of saying things in your writing. So I think the reviewer Booklist said, it's like the easiest to read academic book the reviewer had ever read. But you say things like, the Romans didn't so much believe in their gods as they had gods. And, that's just instantly clarifying and I think very true. Yeah,
there I was. I might have been quoting Robert Wilkin or some other scholars who try to make that point. In some ways, and so that seems to be right. And I take that from scholars of Roman history, and I'm not one of those. But I do also try to say that I think belief is still, it can't be excluded altogether. You can't exactly have gods unless you in some sense believe in them and so forth. So it's an interesting question.
But it's not really theological. It's not really theological. And by the way, I appreciate you mentioning two people about as different as one could imagine, Robert Wilkin and Stanley Fish, and glad to say both of them have been my guests for Thinking in Public. So
really,
again, from two completely different worldviews, and here we are, mentioning them.
Well, that they're probably both very interesting to talk to, then, right?
They are, and both of them incredibly provocative and open in conversation,
right.
And we're dependent upon Professor Wilkin for a lot of our understanding of recent scholarship in the early church, and then also of religious liberty. I mean, he's written this monograph, which we discussed
recent
last
book on that.
On religious liberty, which is really fascinating. But the issue of Lewis, before we leave, even when you begin the book, when he talks about this kind of repaganization of society, which is, I think, exactly what we're witnessing now, a repaganization of society, he makes a statement that the historical process does not allow for a real reversal when you're looking at the trajectory of civilization. He said, quote, "It's not what happens." That's a fairly ominous word, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And when he said that also in a Cambridge lecture, which I haven't really researched this closely, but in reading it, I wondered whether he might have been specifically responding to T.S. Eliot's lectures there a few years earlier. Wow. He might have been, and in a sense, disagreeing with Eliot. But I tend to think that depending on how you define it and how you look at it, there can be truth in both views.
Right.
One might well say, well, the kind of paganism that most people have in mind, and also the kind that C.S. Lewis might have been thinking about, probably can't be revived. So even if you look at that, as to some degree, it's possible to do and say there were a lot of virtues. There was a kind of joy in life in a certain way. The paganism that would be revived would probably not be that sort of appealing kind of paganism. It might be something, much less attractive.
Right.
Lewis would probably write to that extent.
Yeah. Well, by the way, I often get asked by reporters or respond to people in the public when they talk about their fear of the religious right. And I always tell them what you should really fear is the irreligious right. There are different kinds of paganism. There are different kinds of Christian attitude, frankly. But when it comes to the paganism that's being celebrated in our society right now, it's this idea of paganism as sexual liberation. And what you will talk about later in your book as the imminent sacred. And I want to wait for just a moment, because I think that's actually the very best observation you make in the entire book, a crucial category for intelligent Christians trying to understand the world today. But one of the things you're quite candid about in your book, and necessarily so, is the sexual practice of ancient Roman paganism, because it kind of represented a form of institutionalized, a sexual hierarchy. I mean, so many things that you would think that the modern progressive left would say they don't actually believe in. It wasn't just some kind of Foucault vision of polymorphous perversity. It was something quite different.
Well, it was hierarchical, certainly in the sense that it was the norms applicable to men were utterly different than the norms applicable to respectable women. In that sense, it was.
Well, and the free and the unfree.
Yeah, for sure. And that section, I relied quite a lot on a book, not very old, Time Flies. Yes. I'm not sure how long. I was going to say a couple years old. It might be a little more than that. By Kyle Harper, though, who explains how the Roman sexual economy relied so heavily just on slaves and prostitutes, as basically the material that would be used to satisfy the sexual desires of Roman males, essentially.
Yeah. Well, what we're looking at as your book unfolds is the fact that you really trace how so many in the intellectual class in the English-speaking world were really attracted to a vision of paganism that they thought might be a replacement for a declining Christianity from the late 18th century onward. You include a quote from William Wordsworth in which he speaks very much of this. And speaking of just a great God, he said, "I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn," using his poetic language. There really was this revivification of paganism.
Yeah. Someone like Wordsworth, and Romantics are probably in part reacting to a world that, as they perceive, has become kind of commercialized and industrialized and disenchanted, to quote Weber, and I look back sort of fondly and think that older world was, more enchanted. It was, full of poetry and romance and so forth. And, there are depictions of Christianity that are often unfair, but sometimes probably are realizations of some forms and, that do depict it as sort of joyless. I actually think that's one thing that Christians in general probably need most to respond to and show, no, that's not the nature of the faith. It's joyful, it's full of meaning, and that kind of. At some point, I kind of have the sense that our world, whether different aspects that you look at, is becoming so kind of plainly empty of meaning. There's some desperate search for some sort of meaning, and most of the available sources of it are so shallow, that at some point you hope maybe someone will, people generally will wake up and say, actually the only, maybe, or at least one of the only viable sources of what we're looking for is over there, something we've been taught by most of our upbringing to think is, was the thing that squashed it all. But no, that's where it is.
I'm actually working on an essay right now, by the way, kind of demonstrating the decline even of the use of the word joy in a secular context. Instead you have words like happiness or satisfaction. The Christian category of joy has kind of disappeared. It's just not used that much, and I think we have a real opportunity as Christians to.
Yeah, there's more than just the satisfaction of consumer preferences and so forth.
Yes, and Christian joy is rooted in the joy in this real life, in this real world, but without full satisfaction, except in the age of that is to come. That provides a completely different worldview. When I was in college, Professor Smith, I was assigned to read Peter Gay's 2 volumes on the Enlightenment.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
And as a young person in the late 1970s trying to understand the world, Peter Gay helped me a lot, actually, by looking at the Enlightenment and casting it in a different light than I had been taught previously. I actually went to a high school that taught philosophy. I don't know there are anymore, but my philosophy teacher, the Enlightenment was the great unshackling of humanity. And Peter Gay, who, by the way, I think enthusiastically would have said the same thing if you gave him one sentence, but nonetheless, he one of the subtitles of his book was, or one of the volumes was, "The Rise of Modern Paganism." Mm-hmm. And it helped me theologically to see, as a young Christian trying to understand the world, that it reminds me of a statement made back in the 19th century that there are no new heresies. The heresies are all perennial. They just keep showing up in different costume.
Yeah. But I think you're also right that when Peter Gay used that subtitle, he meant it to be an endorsement. He's enthusiastic about it, but
he did see the dark side. He clearly, for one thing, talking about joy, he helped me to see how unhappy many of these Enlightenment figures were. For people who were supposedly newly liberated, they didn't seem very happy about it.
Right.
But you deal with actually the subject of my ongoing concern, which is secularization, and it's a contested category, but only among an elite who want to argue over definitions. The most influential figure in my view was Peter Berger, the late sociologist who lived long enough to revise his understanding of secularization. But he basically said that, we thought the world was going to secularize along the lines of, Durkheim and the idea that, modernity would just push religion out and you'd have this new secular age. And he bought into it until it didn't go that way. As he said, well, it did go that way in Western Europe and the American university campus, but he said it didn't go that way anywhere else.
It didn't go that way in the world generally.
Right. But then he said it's still and so he said what actually happened was pluralization, in which Christianity just becomes one option among others. But by the very end of his life, he said basically that's just secularization in a different tune than we predicted. And yeah, I think he's largely right. It was a different tune, but the average person today is inhabiting a different intellectual world in the West than was possible even a half century ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So secularization didn't happen, as you're saying, in the way that it was expected. People just quit going to church altogether. And I think Peter Berger in about 1968 has something where he says by the 21st century, religious people will inhabit small cells, and they'll and so forth. It didn't happen that way, but as you say, it's really complicated. I have a son actually who's in grad school in sociology at Penn State right now, and sort of studying secularization. He was home 2 or 3 weeks ago, and was talking about different people he's reading. There's still a whole lot of different takes on this, and some of them seem plausible to me. Like, a common view is the differentiation view.
Right.
It's not that people aren't religious anymore, but religion has been relegated in many contexts to the private sphere.
Absolutely.
Excluded from a lot of government, excluded from universities, and so forth. So it's pretty complicated, and something like that has happened.
Yeah, my argument is the Western world in particular, and by its influence, much of the rest of the world is being secularized. It's just an uneven process with different secular variants.
Yeah.
But as a theologian, I'm going to define secularization in the declining binding authority of theism. And so, that someone over here has got a crystal collection, or someone over here has got a ritual consultant for his Fortune 500 corporation. That to me is evidence of the persistence of the religious impulse by the Imago Dei, but there's no binding authority of theism there.
You're right. Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. The one other sort of dimension of this that I try to stress in the book, though, is that I think there's a religious dimension to a lot of what goes by, let's say progressivism.
Absolutely.
It's not secularism of the positivistic kind, just fact value, and we just deal with facts. Yeah. It's religiously infused.
Oh,
it's just
absolutely.
It's not theistic or transcendently infused.
Yeah. I can remember when in high school studying physics, I came to understand the idea of a steady state. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, as a theologian, I say I have a steady state theory of morality and religion. There's never actually more or less. It's just differentially directed, And I'm trying to think of who it was years ago. It may have been someone like Martin Marty who said, we've gone from a society that has infinite rules about sex that now has infinite rules about diet. But moral judgment is present in both.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In your book, Pagans and Christians in the City. By the way, when you say in the city, you really mean in the society, and it's a great way of even using the term that Augustine made, I think, permanently meaningful for us.
I was pretty much trying to use it in that way, with a reference to that. So
yeah, and just for those who may not know, Augustine, the most influential of the church fathers, actually, I would argue, whose great work written as Bishop of Hippo, as the Roman Empire was understood to be falling, was the city of God, in which he described the city of man and the city of God, two different loves, but made very clear that God loves both cities, and thus we as Christians have a responsibility to the city of man, and even a proper love for the city of man, and in particular for the inhabitants thereof, and that takes me to the kind of the last half of your book, because you clearly care about these issues a very great deal. It's not just a dispassionate academic impulse here. But I think the most helpful part of your book is where you make a very clear distinction between the transcendent sacred and the imminent sacred. And honestly, Professor Smith, I have to tell you, if that's all you wrote about in this book, it would have been, I think, an incredibly worthy book. As a theologian, I want to say, I think that distinction applied to our world is just incredibly clarifying. So talk about it for a bit.
Okay, so the initial challenge, I think, in trying to defend, I mentioned already that I thought, well, could I write a book like project that would sort of try to defend T.S. Eliot's thesis and defend it against his suggestion, defend it against, for example, criticisms like the one from C.S. Lewis that you referred to earlier. They say we just can't go back to paganism. The question is there some sense of paganism that we could say is ongoing, and and it still is viable? And this wasn't something I came up with on my own, but reading people like the Egyptologist Jan Osman, and for that matter, Abraham Heschel, the Jewish thinker and rabbi. It did seem that this imminent transcendent distinction might be clarifying here. And so that is kind of the fundamental distinction that runs through the whole book, that there's transcendent religiosity and there's imminent religiosity. And that, of course, is a distinction that theologians have used, for a long time and so forth.
Absolutely.
But it is a really elusive one, to tell you the truth, because in practice, it's not always easy to separate things clearly into the imminent and to the transcendent. And I try to suggest, and I suggest Augustine and others have actually made this point quite emphatically, even in our individual lives, we sort of have tendencies both ways, we're sort of pulled back and forth, I think. So one way it's an essential distinction, and another it's really difficult to apply. And some of the criticism of the book has really emphasized that as well. It's tried to say this distinction doesn't work. You can't really explain anything with it. Or in fact, that I got it backwards. There was a review by a theology professor at USC, I think, David Albertson, who basically says it's just backwards. The pagan religion was transcendent in this orientation, and Christianity was imminent. And I didn't know this really at the time that I was writing the book. I've done, some reading since then. But I think, with movements that are described as modernism, beginning, let's say, in the 19th century and moving into the 20th century, I think within Christian circles themselves, there's been, in some circles, a strong tendency to try to make Christianity an imminent religion rather than a transcendent religion.
Well, let me speak as a theologian here. And so let me tell you, I think you get it basically quite right. And so when we're talking about the terms transcendent and imminent, we're talking properly about theology proper, which is the doctrine of God. And as we speak theologically of the attributes of God, try to describe him as he describes himself, reveals himself in Scripture, he is, first of all, transcendent. He's separate from his creation and Lord over, sovereign over his creation, the entire cosmos. He is also immanent in that he is present in the world, but he's not present in the world bodily, as in paganism, or materially, but rather through the exercise of his sovereignty and then the presence of the Logos, we come to know as the second person of the Trinity, the Lord Jesus Christ, and then the Holy Spirit. And but the movement of 19th century Protestant liberalism and well into the 20th century, it stressed the immanence of God at the expense of his transcendence. So we're not going to talk about the ontological Trinity and issues of formal theism. Instead, we're going to talk about what it means that God loves us. And so, it gets to the creed of the Boston Unitarians, which is the brotherhood of man, the fatherhood of God, and the neighborhood of Boston. And by the time you get to the early 20th century, with liberal forms of postmillennialism, the charge coming from the Orthodox is that what the liberals are trying to do is to immanentize the eschaton. They're trying to redefine all of theology, all of Christian orthodoxy into basically secular terrestrial terms. And so an overstress on the immanence of God is the opposite, actually, of the biblical framework. Just to read the Psalms, and so there's a very good theological basis for what you're saying here. But what I think is crucial to your argument, I'd like to have you spell it a bit more, is the fact that the distinction between transcendent sacred and immanent sacred is that our modern powers that be, the shapers of society, they're quite willing to embrace an immanent sacred, but they don't want anything to do with the transcendent sacred, because that transcendent sacred comes with sentences that take the structure of, for instance, thou shalt not.
Yeah. And I think this was true in Rome in late antiquity, and it's true today. And the thing about the transcendent sacred, which will be attractive to people in some ways, but really quite repelling in other ways, is that there's a standard against which things that happen in history and in this earth can be judged. Yeah. So in a certain sense, that's good, right? Because there's a standard, for example, of justice that we can apply and say, even if this type of thing has been common, slavery, let's say, even if it's been common throughout history, it's unjust. But on the other hand, what human beings often don't like is the idea that everything I do is in some sense subject to some standard of judgment, that can seem oppressive to some people. And I think there's been a lot of resistance anciently and today. There just is, I think, resistance to that.
Well, and you get to very relevant abrasive tension points on this in our society. But before leaving that basic distinction, I think it's just really helpful to understand that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with a more sophisticated understanding of secularization. The sacred is there. It's just that for many people, it's basically a very worldly sacred,
right?
Not a transcendent sacred that with.
And I argue that kind of secularism is probably actually much more common than the sort of official positivistic version that just denies that there's any sort of sacred.
Right. But you really press that in I think a brilliant way when you say that the imminent sacred is very much in the driver's seat in this society, but that really does mean that the transcendent sacred appears to be the enemy of human joy and goodness and liberation. So it's not just that you have both imminent and transcendent claims; it's that those who are committed to an entirely imminent sacred and sacralizing, they see someone like either a Muslim or an Orthodox Jewish person or Orthodox Christianity as a threat to human liberation and flourishing.
Oh, definitely. That's a common perception, I think. Common mistake, I think, but a common perception.
But it explains the world you live in every day, which is a world of the law, which is having to adjudicate so many of these matters.
Well, so if I could, and probably no doubt oversimplified terms, explain what it seems to me has happened.
Yeah.
And I should say, this may sound like I'm treating this as some sort of conspiracy or something, and I don't mean it that way. I think a lot of the times it's happened through well-intended people who just were doing what seemed like the right thing to do. But it would go something like this. In a religiously pluralistic world, it seemed that public norms and the Constitution couldn't depend upon religion because there's no common understanding of that. And so it needed to be secular and neutral. Those things needed to be secular and neutral instead. And those are the common themes in constitutional law in lots of areas. But what actually happens when we say that is that, again, I'm not intending any nefarious conscious designs implying on it on the part of anybody, but essentially is smuggled in a sort of an imminent sacred instead. The transcendent sacred gets excluded, the imminent sacred gets imported under the heading of secularism and religious neutrality and so forth. In a nutshell, I think that's basically what modern constitutional law has done in the area of freedom of religion, but in lots of areas, the different areas that deal with sexual norms and so forth. It's been a kind of an importation of an overall imminent worldview, right, and declared that that's basically our orthodoxy now.
Well, it is our orthodoxy now. And as a matter of fact, at more than one point, you make a statement like, every time the imminent and the transcendent sacred come into conflict in the law, basically the imminent sacred wins or tends to win.
In the law, that tends to be true, and And the reason, once again, though, is because the imminent sacred is clothed in the garb of secular neutrality and so forth,
right,
which is supposed to be just kind of hospitable to everyone. But that's just sort of a false description, I think.
You deal in your book with Harvard law professor Mark Tushnet. In his rather infamous essay of several years ago on abandoning defensive crouch, liberalism. And he really was saying to Orthodox believers and those who would hold to the transcendent sacred, look, we won, you lost. Don't expect any compromise. I'm paraphrasing him here, but it's we won, you lost. Deal with it.
Yeah. Well, he did. I kind of wonder whether he regrets having published that little essay or put it online, a little blog post that he wrote called something like Abandoning Defensive Crouch. And it got a lot of attention and a lot of pushback and so forth. And even from his own side of things, it might have been bad strategy for him to do, to be quite that blunt about things because, people, including me, have quoted him, kind of against his own interest. Yeah. But I should say I'm not wholly unsympathetic to Tushnet. For one thing, I kind of like him as I think he's an honest guy who's trying to understand things and a smart guy and so forth. And the issue that he was talking about in that is a very real issue for a lot of us, I think. It's kind of a question like this. If you, again, somewhat oversimplified, but think of there being two main sides in the culture wars, kind of in the way James Davis and Hunter described it, something like that. I guess an ongoing question for, I think, many people and many Christians is there some possibility, should the hope be to come up with some modus vivendi in which we can all live together? Or is it going to be kind of as Eliot said, no, one side or the other is ultimately going to prevail. Yeah. So Tushnett's clearly on the progressive side of things, and he thought at that point, not implausibly, in fact, I think you've sort of been agreeing with him to some extent, that it looks like the progressive side has prevailed. And he was sort of declaring that in maybe overly blunt terms and so forth, but it's not clear that he was wrong. And so I'm somewhat sympathetic to what he has to say. He, of course, rejoices in that, and I don't. But still, I think he was kind of making an honest statement. We can appreciate him for doing that, I think.
Well, I think we appreciate honesty wherever it's found, but it's a bracing statement, and it helps us to understand why. For instance, one of the things I face continually in public conversation is and private conversation. I'm glad to say I feel responsible to have private conversations, not just public conversations with people who are in many ways intellectual adversaries and on these cultural issues on the other side. And so like you, I think it's important that we understand they think what they're doing is going to serve human flourishing and human good. They think what we're doing is the opposite. So at least we have an honest disagreement here. But many of them simply can't understand that what they have to tell themselves and their side, so to speak, is why, 40 plus years, 47 years after Roe v. Wade, abortion's still an issue and still a contested question. Why, after Obergefell in 2015, same-sex marriage is, in other words, if people won't just get with it and go along, they don't deserve to have a voice in the larger society and the negotiation of its matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are really hard questions, though, aren't they? I mean, even just strategically from a Christian standpoint, you have, I think, people, I don't really know for sure what your view is on some of these things, but I think you have people from, let's say Rusty Reno, who suggests the possibility of some kind, using Eliot, in fact, the possibility of some kind of restoration of a kind of Christian society, to Rod Dreher, who probably gets misrepresented in some ways, but at least the title of his book, Benedict Option, implies to a lot of people some sort of retreat to, we've lost the war and we might as well try and find some enclave retreat. I think those are really hard questions. It is really hard to know what the right course would be at this point.
Well, given my own worldview and theological commitments, and by the way, as a confessional historic Protestant, and even more so as a Baptist of all things, a conversionist, I don't see any way that there's a return to a reestablished Christian consensus without there being an overwhelming return to Christ and to Christianity. In other words, I think what we've had is the residue of that Christian conscience, but I don't think the Christian conscience can be re-imported without Christianity.
Yeah.
But I also think that Rod Dreher, and look, both of them are people to whom I have very friendly relations and fertile cross-fertilization in thinking. Mm-hmm. Rod Dreher's a friend, I would say, and But I just want to point out that, the Benedict option isn't what it might appear at first if you're doing interviews worldwide about it and being published by a major publisher in that larger world. And by the way, that's no hypocrisy on Rod's part, because he's honest about what he's doing. But there's some people who look at that and think it just means absolute withdrawal. The reality is that Christians, as a cognitive minority in this world, while we're in a representative democracy, a constitutional republic, are going to be in a continual struggle to figure out where we have to, what we have to do to be faithful in a society that's increasingly pressing us to the margins, and wants our children. And I don't mean that in a conspiratorial sense. Again, no. It's not a conspiracy if they tell you what they're trying to do. I mean, right. they want to create a society that follows their vision of human flourishing, which we think is false.
Well, here, if you don't mind, if I just...
Please.
So for me, one place where this sort of choice or issue shows up is let me put it this way. I occasionally do a little bit of work with an organization, I'm sure you're familiar with it, called ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom. I've written sort of like amicus briefs.
Yep. I've worked with them as well.
In cases. And I'm also a member, actually, somewhat heterodox member, but of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that sort of orchestrated what's often called as like the fairness for all situation in Utah. So ADF tends to be more like hardline on certain, we don't want to compromise. If we compromise, we're just going to be losing out more and more. Whereas the other approach is like, no, we need to find some terms in which we can all just, and I sort of see the attraction of both of those positions. And I just actually don't even know where to land on those positions. So
without belaboring it, since you kind of raised the issue, I'm very unhappy about the fairness for all proposals and the so-called Utah Compromise, because it makes a distinction between institutional religion, which would be protected, and Christians or religious believers in the world who will then be abandoned. I can't in conscience make that abandonment. And I think that that's where Mark Tushnet's quote's really helpful. It's kind of a bracing reality point. The kind of people who will sign that kind of agreement from the, say, LGBTQ side are the kind of people who will sign that kind of agreement. They're not necessarily the kind of people who will be actually making the decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have your reservation and, both of the kinds of reservations you've expressed, I think, here. And actually one time a few years ago, I was giving a talk in Utah, and people were asking me about this. And I said, sometimes I have the impression that here in Utah, it's easy enough to say this because on both sides of the issue, the people who are cooperating together, are pretty much relatively moderate and in good faith and so forth. And so you think it will work pretty well, and maybe it will here, but I'm not sure it's going to work that well when you get other people involved, in other places and so forth. And sometimes I've wondered whether it's a little naive to think that could work. I mean, it's introduced, as you probably know, in Congress now. Right. But whether that could work out well at that level, it doesn't, I'm not sure. I mean,
just to make that point, politically, it doesn't stand a chance in the House under the current leadership. So it won't be passed. Yeah. Although you may also have noticed, commentary by Michael McConnell and others that suggest that you can interpret the Supreme Court's some of the decisions over the last term as essentially the Supreme Court trying to bring about something like that compromise. If you put Bostock together with some decisions that seem to give pretty strong protection to religious freedom, you can read it as the court trying to bring about what Congress would never probably be able to pass. Right. But there again, whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. Well, and the other thing is something like this. I have lots of doubts about whether that will work out well. Yeah. But the other side is, so what should we be trying for? Is it just some kind of increasing polarization and some kind of civil war of some sort or other? That's why I think this is a really hard question. Well, I think the questions like this are always answered over time. And so, just the Supreme, you're the legal scholar, but my My point to make in response to what you said about the Supreme Court's adjudication on these issues is, yes, that's true. But the Supreme Court's dealing with two things there. One of them is the Constitution of the United States. The other is statutory law. And if something passes like the Equality Act that has already passed the House, that would reshift the situation. The court will then have to deal with the law. So Congress could basically adjudicate this in a way that eliminates a lot of the religious liberty protections that the court has put in place.
Sure. Yeah. No, I didn't mean to be endorsing the Supreme Court decisions, and I think the Bostock decision was an atrocious decision.
Agreed.
Actually, and I've written some things, or one thing at least, criticizing that already. But so.
You early in the book raise the question of Douglas Laycock, who by the way is in this season of Thinking in Public, in which he kind of asked the question: why is it that those who are pressing, I'll just say from the left, have to go to such an extreme that they will find the one cake baker in town who won't bake the cake and make him or her a national case? And I have to say, by the time we get to the end of your book, you really do kind of answer Laycock's question. But you don't take it as it was not quite as satisfying a conclusion as I was looking for. So now I've got the author on the line, and I can say, so let me ask you to answer Laycock's question. Why is it so that those who are pressing this moral revolution can't even let one cake baker alone?
Yeah. So in fairness, to say two things. I mean, one, Doug's a really reasonable guy, I think, and has done tremendously good work in this area. Absolutely. And I think he is genuinely trying to find some middle ground that should be. The other thing is that there are other people who are trying to do that too. It's not that everybody is equally aggressive, of course. Right. But you're right that there are plenty of people who are aggressive in that way. And I guess my thought, and I try to bring out a bit in the book, is that just as in, as I said a moment ago, in ancient Rome, you did have two fundamentally incompatible, and there wasn't really any way to really reconcile them harmoniously. So there was ultimately going to be some sort of a conflict. And when Eliot thought the same was true today, right? Some people, at least on both sides, also think that that's true today. And so given that, they and people like, Mark Tushnet his essay would have expressed this view, say, so one side's going to win, and we've got to sort of make that clear. So we've got to drive out of the public square the people who are holding to the other philosophies. I think not everybody thinks that, but there are a lot of people who do, I think.
So just in closing, we're about out of time here, but I just want to ask you, with that in mind, what's the future of the free exercise clause? Because you would think that we have from the very ratification of the U.S. Constitution a guarantee that we can't be silenced. But what does that really mean these days?
Well, at least there are some indications, and this is maybe just a short-term forecast, that the Supreme Court right now is fairly strongly committed to the free exercise clause. And in a case they're going to hear this year, the sort of Fulton against Philadelphia case, they've actually put on the agenda, should Employment Division against Smith, the decision in 1990 that sort of reduced free exercise protection, should it be reconsidered? I think there does seem to be a majority of justices who seem to be quite committed to free exercise, and I regard that as a good thing. However, I don't think it's a stable thing without some sort of cultural and legal foundation for that, which I don't believe we have at the moment, So in that sense, the future of the free exercise clause to me is much more up in the air, and it'll depend on broader developments and not just sort of what lawyers and judges say about free exercise.
So what writing project are you working on now? What should we be looking for?
Well, I actually just sort of finished a manuscript that's going to be published by Notre Dame Press of a book called, Fictions, Lies, and the Authority of Law or something. And it deals with a number of normal, let's say ordinary legal questions like constitutional interpretation and statutory interpretation and so forth. But it also it takes off from Hannah Arendt's provocative statement that authority has disappeared from the modern world. We no longer know what it is. And this amounts to the loss of the groundwork of the world. So I try to use these legal issues again to get into that. And it ends with a sort of an Augustinian conclusion, a little bit like a theme that runs through the Pagans and Christians book.
Absolutely. Professor Stephen D. Smith at the University of San Diego in California, you've been incredibly generous with your time. This is a down payment on a conversation I look forward to having about your next book as soon as it comes out.
I hope so. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been an honor.
Thank you. God bless you, sir.
Okay, you too.
I really do believe that Pagans and Christians in the City is one of the most important books written in recent decades, having to do with our cultural situation and where religious believers stand. And I'm speaking here as an evangelical Christian at the beginning of the 21st century, and now as we're working our way into it. The issues are only going to become more fervent. They're only going to become more urgent. And the necessity of Christian thinking is only going to become more important and primary in our lives. So with that as a responsibility, let me encourage you to read Pagans and Christians in the City. I enjoyed this conversation with Professor Stephen D. Smith, and I want to thank him again for joining with me and thinking with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode of Thinking in Public, you'll find more than 100 of these conversations at albertmohler.com under the tab Thinking in Public. For more information on the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, go to sbts.edu. For information on Boyce College, just go to boycecollege.com. Thank you for joining me for Thinking in Public. Until next time, keep thinking. I'm Albert Mohler.